After reaching a time in her life that Loretta Saunders called rock bottom, she picked herself up and earned herself a degree in criminology. But very little did she know that in February 2014, and after specialising in missing and murdered Indigenous women, she would become the very type of victim that she dedicated her studies to. And what remained in the midst of her disappearance was a harrowing story that her friends and family would have to endure. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, folks. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to another video by Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're looking at the solved disappearance of Loretta Saunders. Now, before we begin, and just to let you know that I post true crime and strange cases here weekly, so if that is your sort of thing, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. And with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, buckle up, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Loretta Saunders. Our case today takes us back to the beautiful and sometimes unforgiving country of Canada. In this video, we're focusing on Canada's ocean playground, also known as Nova Scotia. It's a province almost entirely surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, giving it some of the best beaches in the country. In fact, while here, you are never more than 40 miles away from the coast of Nova Scotia, and the province heavily capitalizes on this. Numerous fishing ports can be found along many of its more densely populated areas. In its capital city, Halifax, this is no exception. It's a port city with the longest boardwalk in the world, where you can enjoy food and drink while admiring the vast Atlantic Ocean. It is here in Halifax that we meet the young woman Loretta Saunders. Loretta was born in Happy Valley Goose Bay in Newfoundland on August 25, 1987. And this was to her loving parents, Miriam Teriak, a native Inuit, and Clayton Saunders, a man of Inuit and European descent. Loretta was the fifth child in a blended family, with her mother having two children from a previous relationship. But for Clayton, Loretta was one of his first children, who he cherished dearly, to the point she was affectionately nicknamed Little Princey. Now, Loretta's family was unique and much larger than those typically related by blood alone, as her parents often fostered local Indigenous children who were homeless or mistreated. Over the years, they took in dozens of youngsters, and regularly had 10 to 12 people around the dinner table. And although the house was always busy, life was happy in the household. Even from a young age, Loretta was an ambitious young woman. She had aspirations to become a detective or a lawyer, whichever would help people the most. And she did try her best to achieve this goal, but unfortunately, while in high school, something changed. Unfortunately, during 9th grade, Loretta experienced bullying behaviour, and all of this would reach a peak when, one day, her parents received a call from the school. Loretta had punched another classmate, which was out of character for her, but upon investigation, all of this was for good reason, as this classmate had tried to grope her breasts. Now, Miriam and Clayton could not be too angry at her for this, so instead of punish her, they took her out of school and re-enrolled her into a new one. But this incident affected her quite massively, and so, at the age of 15, she decided to move to Montreal to start a new life of her own. Life in the big city was far more complicated than she could have imagined, and unfortunately, Loretta eventually found herself on the streets. To make things worse, this was when she was introduced to drugs and alcohol, and she endured this hard homeless life for more than a couple years. But deep down, Loretta knew this wasn't the path she was meant to be on. She knew she needed to escape and get herself back on track. She therefore decided to move back to Newfoundland, where family members noticed she was more gaunt, depressed, and slept a lot more often. But thankfully, soon after this, her determination seemed to make a comeback, and admirably, she finished her high school studies between working night shifts. Loretta had also found comfort in her heritage. She began to ask her parents about their experiences as Indigenous Inuit people, and became interested in traditional healing and smudging ceremonies. After Loretta gained her high school equivalents, she then moved to Halifax to study sociology and criminology. Her sister Delilah went with her, and the two lived together while she completed her undergraduate degree. Now this is just a forewarning, but in a dark and cruel twist of irony, Loretta specialised in Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women, as an ongoing problem for her postgraduate studies. Loretta's studies meant everything to her, and in her mind, she was determined to make a big difference within her specialty. Friends say that she saw herself, her sisters, and her peers within these statistics, and of course this motivated her greatly. In November 2013, Delilah moved away to British Columbia to start her own life, leaving Loretta alone to continue with her studies. And life appeared to be moving rather fast for Loretta too, as just 1 month later, she fell pregnant with her boyfriend Yalchin Sakalte. Loretta and Yelchin had a very happy and healthy relationship. The two were planning a future together, and so with the revelation of Loretta's pregnancy, she began to spend most of her time at his place. But Loretta's postgraduate funding was also eventually cut off, and so she had to find the money to fund it elsewhere. To make financial ends meet, she decided to sublet the second room that had once been Delilah's. This led to her finding a couple willing to take the room on Kijiji, which is a popular site in Canada. Due to the nature of her contract, there could be no official agreement, and therefore it all had to be kept under the table. She sublet the room to 25-year-old Blake Leggett and his 28-year-old girlfriend Victoria Hennebury. They were looking for a place to stay, and so the couple moved in January on an agreed $430 per month. But by the time February had rolled around, the second month, the two had missed their payment. Now, Loretta was a patient woman, and although they had failed to pay their rent, she gave them the benefit of the doubt. But despite this, as the delays changed from days into weeks, no payment ever came. Loretta was growing frustrated at the situation, and so, on February 13th, 2014, she told Yelchin that she was going over to collect the money that she was owed. At 10:57 AM on the morning of February the 13th, a surveillance camera captured her entering the elevator of her apartment complex. Loretta seemed to be on a mission, but otherwise behaved normally. She was wearing jeans, a hoodie, and ankle-length boots. But sadly, little did anyone know that this would be the last time she would be publicly recorded. Although Loretta had planned to return home straight afterwards, several hours passed with no word from her, and Yelchin was beginning to wonder where she had gone. Saying this, he wasn't overly concerned about her, as she liked her own free space and independence. But that was when, late that evening, he received a strange message from her phone. The message read, "I am so stressed. I need money, but I've locked myself out of my banking apps. I am so stressed, I can't even remember my own mother's middle name." Other members of her family received these text messages too, and it was an immediate red flag. It was almost as if she had failed to log into her banking apps and failed to answer security questions. These strange text messages carried on for the next 24 hours, which led family and friends to believe that she was out there troubled and struggling. And still being on a recovery plan for methamphetamine, Loretta had a very turbulent past, and all those who knew this grew further concerned. But the most alarming clue is that Loretta had not been in contact with her father Clayton for the last few days, which was extremely strange as the two were very close. So on February the 17th, 4 days since anyone had last heard from Loretta, they decided to finally report her as missing to authorities. Loretta's family were determined to help in the search. Many of them made the trip down to Halifax to support ongoing investigations. And after speaking to her partner, authorities had an obvious starting point. And of course, that would be the apartment complex. Although her tenants had recently moved in, Yelchin actually knew nothing about them. They joined through a private site, there was no official written contract, and Loretta had arranged the entire thing alone. But luckily for the police, the one surveillance camera inside the complex covered the only way in and out. It was impossible to enter or exit the building without being captured by CCTV. Although authorities would eventually spot her walking into the apartment, she was never actually spotted leaving on the camera. But after questioning other residents and neighbours, officers finally learned the names and faces of those who had replaced her in the apartment. And to further arouse suspicion, the couple had suddenly disappeared on the Valentine's Day break. Investigators would eventually gain access to Loretta's bank records, and it was confirmed that her card had been used multiple times since her disappearance. But throughout all of this activity, one transaction stood out above the others. In typical Canadian fashion, but at approximately 5 PM on February the 13th, Loretta's bank card made a transaction at the local Tim Hortons. Her blue Toyota was captured pulling up at the drive-thru, before making a touchscreen transaction with the card. The surveillance footage is grainy to say the least, but it is confirmed that 2 people were inside, and this meant that Loretta wasn't alone. But who was she with? There was a second surveillance camera too. Another one existed inside Tim Hortons, focusing on the drive-thru window. And although the assistant was obstructing the view into the car for most of the surveillance footage, one slight movement towards the end revealed the driver. In the driver's seat was a balding white male, and this was definitely not Loretta's boyfriend. There also appeared to be someone in the passenger seat accompanying him, who at the time they could only assume was Loretta in a blue coat. Although this surveillance footage was critical to investigators, they still had no leads on where the vehicle or its passengers travelled after this. Their only hope was to scour the area for more surveillance cameras in hopes that one would pick up the blue Toyota. And fortunately, just 100 yards away from Tim Hortons, another clue surfaced. Several minutes before driving to Tim Hortons, Loretta's car was spotted in front of the local Sobeys grocery store. A female figure then exited from the passenger side before walking into the store, but the interior camera revealed some more concerning clues. With a different hair colour and body shape, the blue-coated woman was obviously not Loretta, and this posed some very serious questions. Who were these people? Where was Loretta? And why did they have access to her car and bank card? No other clues immediately followed this, and with Loretta missing for over a week, her family made a public statement pleading for any information that may lead to her being found.
Supporters are distributing a new batch of posters desperate for more clues. With the likelihood of good news diminishing, her sister is drawing on Loretta's character to persevere.
She is so strong, and that's what's keeping me going through this. Knowing that she wouldn't want us, wasting time crying and, sitting around feeling bad.
More family members are flying to Halifax next week to endure the painful mystery together.
News of the missing woman spread far and wide across Canada, and her face and the blue Toyota became national symbols of interest. Authorities remained hopeful and resilient, but everyone seemed to wonder if she would ever be found again. It is unfortunately very easy to forever disappear in a massive country like Canada. But spanning that enormous distance, a clue finally surfaced. Around 2,000 miles away and right on the edge of the US border in Harrow, local police received a phone call. It was a random tip made on the off chance by a stranger who had heard of the news, and in a residential area nearby, they had noticed a blue Toyota. Now the police, they expected this phone call to be a dead end, but after arriving at the property, it proved to be worth its weight in gold, as that blue Toyota had the exact same license plate. Police officers were suspicious, to say the least. They soon noticed that both individuals inside the property matched those found on the surveillance footage, and so they therefore made the decision to arrest them immediately. The two were formally identified to be Blake Leggett and Victoria Henbury, and the IDs found inside their wallets confirmed that they were in fact the same couple living in Loretta's apartment. Since at the time there was no evidence of foul play over the disappearance of Loretta, they were instead arrested on charges of possession of a stolen vehicle and a bank card. Throughout the first moments of their initial questioning, their alibis seemed to match. Both Blake and Victoria claimed that they had bought Loretta's car from her, as they were planning to visit their friends in Harrow over Valentine's Day. But shortly after this, the two made one critical mistake. While Blake told investigators that they had left straight for Harrow earlier that week, Victoria claimed that they were in a completely different part of the country when Loretta went missing. And with this inconsistency of alibis, they therefore tangled themselves into a lie. This was only the very beginning of their rapid descent into jail, as after frisking the pair, officers discovered that Loretta's phone was in Victoria's possession. With this clue in mind, detectives decided to revisit the apartment's surveillance footage, and what they found was highly damning towards the couple. At 2:28 PM, 3 hours since Loretta had gone up the elevator, Blake Leggett was captured coming down with a large hockey bag, which seemed heavy and full of luggage. He then returned to the building carrying a plastic bag, but after disappearing and returning into view, the bag was gone. After heading back upstairs, Blake reappeared with more luggage, and after returning home once more, he came back down the elevator for a third time. But in this instance, he was not alone. This time, Victoria was with him. She was wearing the same blue coat that she was spotted in at Sobeys and Tim Hortons. Now, police immediately suspected foul play. The way that Blake carried that bag was not normal at all, and it sagged in the middle very awkwardly, as if something very heavy was inside. But without ever finding that hockey bag, they would never know what was inside, and all they could do at this moment in time was interrogate both of them over the matter. Now, the next clue that officers found is so ridiculous that it's almost laughable. But after searching Blake's mobile phone, they found a video recording of him arguing with Victoria. The argument is about murdering Loretta, and it was taken just a few days before she disappeared. And why you would ever record such a thing is absolutely baffling to me. Anyway, here it is.
This is why Victoria should not drink.
You really think I don't want to be with you? When I'm
if
sober?
you
Stupid?
Why? What have I done?
You can't even say that you really want to kill Loretta. You said that you want to kill her earlier.
When did I say that?
You're a liar. You're the one who said.
You
Oh, I wanna kill Loretta. I can't
you
wait.
just said.
It is clear from this recording that police were dealing with a very volatile pair, both of which had discussed the murder of their landlord just days before she went missing. And although Blake continued to feign innocence, even after being shown the surveillance footage and his recording, Victoria couldn't maintain the facade for much longer. And just several hours later, she meekly told her interrogator that Blake had killed Loretta. Before they could fully incriminate either or both of the suspects, they needed to know where Loretta was, and perhaps Victoria was willing to help them solve this piece of the puzzle. Eventually, with some persuasion, she agreed to lead investigators to where they had dumped her body. Found along the Trans-Canada Highway, just north of Salisbury and in an area with heavy snow, Loretta's body was finally discovered. She was found inside the familiar hockey bag, with her head wrapped in layers of plastic. A post-mortem examination conducted on her remains ruled that the cause of her death was asphyxiation, which matched the story that Victoria had given to officers. Victoria had claimed that Loretta had arrived at the apartment just before 11 AM that Thursday. She knocked on the door to the apartment, Victoria answered, and Loretta walked in. After asking why she hadn't paid her rent yet, Victoria lied. She said that she had lost her bank card, but that she would call her bank immediately for a replacement. Retreating to the kitchen, she next heard Blake pacing in the hallway just out of sight. And although they had discussed it beforehand, she apparently had no idea that her boyfriend was gearing himself up to commit murder. He marched into the living room, wrestled Loretta to the floor, and put 3 plastic bags over her head. When Loretta fought back, he sat on top of her and knocked her out against the floor. He then held her there until she suffocated. Once he was sure that Loretta was dead, Blake then called Victoria in for help. They stuffed Loretta's body into the hockey bag, and Blake made several trips down to Loretta's blue Toyota while Victoria packed their bags. Throughout their trip from Sorbet's to Tim Hortons, and out of sight from surveillance cameras, Loretta's dead body was lying inside the trunk. After leaving Halifax, Blake and Victoria made their way to Harrow to stay with a friend, and throughout this trip, the snowfall that was gently falling onto the roads turned into a fierce blizzard. It was in this moment they decided they would now hide Loretta's body under a thick blanket of snow that could last many months in Canada. Now, the original plan was to flee the country, and by the time Loretta's body had been found, they would be long gone. But it turns out Victoria couldn't keep a secret after all, and just 2 weeks later, they were behind bars. Loretta's family were distraught by the news. They had long hoped for her safe return. And with the discovery of her body came the realization they would never embrace her again. And all of that sadness would soon turn into anger. Victoria Hanbury and Blake Leggett would take the brunt of these emotions, and in April 2016 they would formally stand trial. Although Victoria had essentially confessed to the crime, the pair remained innocent until their final trial. She eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and as a result, received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 10 years. As the one to physically take Loretta's life, Blake pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Loretta Saunders left a large hole in her close-knit family, with her murder meaning they had lost a daughter, a sister, a cousin, an aunt, and a friend. The crime is harrowing enough, but it takes on a whole new level of heartbreak when we remember that Loretta was 3 months pregnant at the time she was murdered. Yalchin was unfortunately the man to lose the most here. Not only will he ever see or kiss his wife again, but he will never meet their baby either. No doubt, Loretta had a troubled past, but how she changed and rebuilt herself towards a more positive future is beyond admirable, especially with her dedication to help missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that is what makes this case so dark, because as it turns out, she would become the very victim she had studied and devoted her work towards. Loretta was frustrated and saddened at the very apparent problem of violence against Indigenous women in Canada, and how their voices are often muted and misunderstood in the press. I have said this before in previous cases, but this is an ongoing epidemic in North America, and it desperately needs to be resolved. There are other dark side notes to this story too. Apparently, Loretta's case was initially worked on with a great sense of urgency, and officers appeared professional and respectful to her family. She was initially described as a slim white woman, but when her mother Miriam corrected officers on this by informing them that Loretta was of Inuit descent, police engagement apparently faltered, and authorities took less care in finding her. Many attribute this to Loretta's outward appearance, because she was pale, blue-eyed and blonde, and although her heritage ran deep, she was outwardly Caucasian passing. The family claimed this is why the case initially had a lot of traction, but later on fizzled out. And not to mention, but there were very obvious suspects in this case too. Loretta was a very admirable woman, and will remain so for many years to come. Her message of believing that Indigenous women are not to be disrespected or mistreated have been heard by millions of others. It's a message that I'm sure will, one day, help resolve the epidemic that we are currently facing. Who knows what else Loretta could have achieved for her community? Unfortunately, that is something we will never find out. Her entire life and future were stolen from her by two evil, greedy monsters, and all of this was over the measly sum of $600. I sincerely hope that her friends, family, peers, and Yelchin will eventually find peace moving forward. But that just about wraps up another case today, folks, so thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. If you found this case interesting or insightful, then please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. Oh, and by the way, a huge thank you to Amulet Hara and 800 others of you for recommending this case. There are some very dark and twisted side notes to this story, and I'm sure it's one I'll remember for a very long time. Lesson learned today, but recording on 3 hours sleep is definitely not a good vibe, so I'm off to get some sleep now. In the meantime, please remember to share your thoughts in the comment section down below, and as always, I'll be back again very soon for another video. But until that moment arrives, please remember to look after each other and of course stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.